Now, but the question is, what countries do you want to give flexibility to, and which countries do you not want to give flexibility to? So countries that have political systems, countries where you believe that the government is competent and is going to spend the money in ways which are going to promote development, providing budget support for those types of countries is probably fine. Providing budget support to some of the other countries where the level of capacity of the governments is also often quite limited is not necessarily the right thing to do, and sometimes you do want to impose conditions. Now, but in both cases value judgments are involved. So you decide that this is a responsible government and this is going to spend the government in a sensible development way and stuff like that. Well, to some extent you're making a political judgment about a country, and this is an approved country. Now, what factors get involved in that decision? You know, probably all kinds of things are involved in that judgment. For some of these smaller countries, yes, you may well want to impose that, you know, the money should be spent on whatever. So I don't think budget support is the right answer for everybody, but in countries that, like Ghana, for example, which is a country which is growing quite well, which is reasonably competently managed and stuff, in a country like that, budget support may be appropriate. In a country that's much more unstable, that's recovering from conflict, that's got very little institutions, budget support may not be appropriate. I think there was one here, but I'll come to you in a second.
I was wondering your views on trade, not aid, using aid as creating wealth instead of reducing poverty.
I think trade is definitely. I mean, trade doesn't create dependencies. So I mean, if you're able to export, if you're able to create revenue and stuff like that, a country is able to earn money. That is, I think, is the best way to earn resources, because you're not answerable to anybody. You're not answerable to the donor that gave you the money. You've got to be able to sell your products and stuff like that, and there's all kinds of issues about the trading system and stuff like that, and whether people have fair access, and that's a whole other discussion. But I think growth based on trade, based on exporting, is definitely a positive story. Now, let's look at some of the development success stories. Let's look at China. Let's look at India. Let's look at Vietnam. What's been important? Trade has always been important in those countries. Now, the difference between those countries and some of the ones we're talking about here is that they're big countries. And that's an advantage, because they're bigger countries. But trade was a really important part of the development of those countries, and aid wasn't. Trade generates growth, generates development, generates poverty reduction. Aid might generate growth, but it's debated. And there are these issues about how the aid is used, and is it helping poverty reduction. I think trade is definitely the thing that countries should be seeking to do above anything else. But it's difficult for all countries to break into the world markets, especially if they're all producing similar products.
Yeah. I think this year there was quite a lot of controversy about the government's plans to, continue giving aid to a country like India, which is actually exporting very well. It's sort of doing very well as an economy. And what's your view on that now that Britain's still giving a substantial amount of its budget, effectively of aid, to India, which is perhaps in a much better position than countries in Africa?
I mean, the first thing to say is India is a very big country, and the population of India is much bigger than the whole population of Africa. So that's one thing. The second thing is India is a mix of countries. I mean, different states in India are really very different. There are states in India that are very poor and that have not progressed significantly. There are states in the north and northeast, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh and stuff like that are really quite poor. Whereas there are other states that are really dynamic and have grown. The aggregate story in India is growth, trade, poverty reduction, but it doesn't happen everywhere. There are parts of India where that doesn't happen. there are parts of India where you're not getting so much poverty reduction, you're not getting so much growth. But the government position is, when governments give aid, they give aid to the government of the country, they give aid to the government of India. Now, they would like to see the aid spent in the poorer states of India. The government of India gets the money. Is it going to spend it in the poorer states? I mean, I think it's a difficult question. India is certainly a country which is graduating, which is a country which is progressing, is a country which in some sense should have the resources to be able to cope with its poorer states itself. Because the rich states earn enough money, and if that could be transferred to the poorer states, then that would be good for the country. Whether they're going to do it is another question. But it's hard for the UK government, for example, to say, we're giving you money, giving you India money, but you've got to spend it in Bihar. You can't enforce that. I'm not sure if that's a direct answer to the question, but yeah.
Do you think donor countries such as the UK should be able to take aid away from recipient countries if they do something they don't like, such as the Uganda case with the homosexuality laws?
Yeah. I mean, the way that tends to work is, I mean, once the money is given, it's hard to take the money back, but it's whether or not you continue to give next year or not. Now, you often get that. So, I mean, Ethiopia, for example, was a country which was very popular with donors, and then because of policy changes that annoyed the donors, they stopped giving money. Uganda has often been a darling of the donors, and they'd love to give money to it. But then periodically they get annoyed with Uganda and start to withdraw money from Uganda. And something like this homosexuality issue, is potentially a really important question. Now, of course, that makes things difficult for Uganda, because then it's hard for it to predict how much aid it's going to receive in future. But it also might be, but people giving money, can want to support countries that are allowing a reasonable standard of human rights, for example, and if a policy goes against that, then they may choose to withdraw. And I think that's all right. I mean, it's difficult for again whose judgment is right, but I mean, as a donor country, and if you have a sort of motivation of supporting human rights, I think that's probably all right.
Some economists are more concerned with like 0.1% growth as opposed to lowering infant mortality rate. So, and you mentioned those studies that were looking at, is aid beneficial to growth?
Yeah.
But are there enough studies looking at, is aid beneficial to things like infant mortality rate, things like life expectancy? Because that's, at the end of the day, that's just as important as for countries growing or...
Well, in the end, that's what we care about.
Yeah.
In the end, what we care about is these outcomes. In the end, I mean, what things do we care about more than whether a child survives to their first birthday or their fifth birthday? What more basic thing is there than that? And so, if a kid is not able to survive to their first or their fifth birthday, isn't that the only thing you want to know about welfare and how well off a society is? The reality is that there are very few studies of that. A lot of them focus on growth because the data for growth is easier, and perhaps because you think the aid is going to impact on growth. But often aid is not about growth. Often aid is precisely about healthcare, for example, and therefore helping to reduce mortality. And good use of healthcare, people making good use of healthcare, there's quite a lot of evidence that's good for reducing child mortality. But I think we need a lot more studies that look at precisely those sort of questions. What's been the impact of aid in poverty reduction? What's been the impact of aid on mortality? What's been the impact of aid on whatever? Now, the difficulty one always has is to separate out the impact of aid from the impact of other things, because other things also affect that. Yeah.
Do you think that aid can be more productive if we give it indirectly through our own organisations? You mentioned like Oxfam and and lots of different charities that go and, you know, try and provide business startups or provide clean water and lots of different things like that. Do you think it's more effective than perhaps giving it to the government?
I increasingly feel that you know, I think a lot of the small-scale projects are often more effective. Now, organisations like Oxfam are sort of growing into multinational enterprises in their own right, really. So these organisations have become really big. So, I mean, whether it's always just the sort of Oxfams and the Saves the Children's and so on that one should be giving the money to, or whether it should be a lot of other much smaller NGOs and have a sort of let a thousand flowers bloom type attitude and support a lot of things. More and more countries are giving money to non-governmental organisations to implement projects. That's happening more and more. And I think it is important, and often these organisations have got lots of knowledge, lots of local contacts and stuff like that. So I think it's potentially is a good thing to do. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Any other questions?
We'll call it. Yeah. We'll call it. Oh, do you have a question? Oh, right, we'll call it.
Thank you, and well done to you for all the questions. Thank you.